I've been doing some work with these Aerogarden hydroponic systems, and I have several of them, so I wanted to do a comparison test. I have 3 units. This here is the Letpot, and I've done a review on it. It's a slightly higher end system than the other 2, and it has a higher light level. If I remember correctly, the light on this was about 15,000 lux, whereas these other ones, when they're set to maximum, are only 9,000. I have 2 of the less expensive units over there, and they're identical. So what I've decided to do is to do a comparison between this unit and that unit, growing plants hydroponically, and then on that unit I'm using the light system to grow plants in soil. Now, one of the things that all these hydroponic manufacturers claim is that their systems grow plants much faster than in soil. One of these manufacturers claims growth that is 5 times as fast, and I just don't buy that. I've been growing in soil my whole life, and I don't see why hydroponics would be that much faster. So I'm doing 2 tests here. I want to compare hydroponics to soil, and I want to compare this unit in hydroponics to that unit. So this is how I've set up the experiment. Now, when you do these kind of things, it's really important to have good control. First thing I did was I made up some fertilizer solution. I'm using the Master Blend lettuce fertilizer mixture. I made it up in a big container. So I was able to take the exact same fertilizer solution and put it in both of these 2 units. I'm also using that fertilizer solution to water my soil pots, which are over here. I've got all the units set for veg mode. On this unit, that gives me the most amount of light, and it includes blue light. On these other 2 units, there's a flaw in the software. When you set it to veg mode, you don't get any blue light. You only get blue light in seedling mode, but then the amount of light is a little less. So I've left them in veg mode in all cases. The height of the lights is 7 inches above this base. In the case of my seedling plants, I set the light so it's 7 inches above the surface of the soil. That should give me a good comparison. In each case, the seed is a little lower than the surface of the unit or the surface of the soil. But once the plant germinates and starts growing, they're pretty much growing the same distance from the light. Again, it's important to have good control. If we had these lights at different heights, it wouldn't tell us anything. In each case, I'm testing 3 plants. I have some Tiny Tim tomatoes, some lettuce, and some basil. I put 3 seeds of each one into the pods or into the soil and left them to germinate. My plan is to cut off the extras and leave it so that I only have 1 plant. The lights are on for 14 hours a day in every case. I have the pump on so that each unit is pumping liquid around for a certain number of minutes a day. The programming is a little different between the Letpot and these other no-name, but it does come on several times an hour. I hadn't planned to make this part of the video yet, but I'm starting to see some differences already, so I thought, well, we might as well have a look. It's been a little over 2 weeks, and the seeds have mostly germinated and the plants are starting to grow. So let's have a close look at each unit and see what the plants are doing. This is the no-name unit, and it was the first one to actually have germinating plants. I have my lettuce here, my basil in the middle, and my tomatoes on the right side. In all cases, I've tried to put the plants as close to the center of the light as I can. Now on this one, I have a little streptocarpus over here for testing. But once these plants start to grow, I'll take this away, and this isn't really going to affect the result. The lettuce plants are growing quite nicely. The basil's up, doing well. And the tomato plants are doing well too. All 3 seedlings have germinated. They're all growing. They're all producing their first true leaves. Color's nice and green. They look quite healthy. These are my potted seedlings. The lettuce is doing quite well. And in fact, this might be the largest lettuce out of the whole bunch. The tomatoes are not growing quite as well as the previous hydroponic system, but they have all germinated. And 2 out of the 3 basils are doing quite well. And in fact, these basil plants are larger than the hydroponic system. It's time for an update, and it's time to make some changes in my process. The tomato plants are growing quite well, and about a week and a half ago, I increased the height of the light by 1.5 inches because the plants were getting too close to the light. And this one again is almost touching the light. But the height of the tomato plant in each case is now a little different. So rather than having the lights at the same height in each system, what I'm going to do from now on is I'm going to have the light 1.5 inches away from the top of the tomato plant. I think that will give us a better comparison of the three systems. Now let's have a close look at each system. The Letpot system has been doing fairly well. It has the largest tomato plant and it's starting to make flowers. It's also the tallest plant and it seems to have the largest amount of leaf surface. If we have a look at the root system, looking really good. In fact, the tomato is getting so tall that I think I'm going to have to put a little stake in here and tie it up. The basil is doing quite well too. The main stem is doing well. It's got several side branches, and out of the three growing systems, the basil is also the largest. That brings us to the lettuce plant. It's finally starting to appear, but this has been really slow. Whoops! See what I mean? The tomato plant is too big. Well, we'll fix that in a few minutes. As you can see, the lettuce plant is really tiny. This is the first seed that germinated, and I'm just now seeing the second one come along. So I'll pull that one out and we'll try to get this one growing well. So as far as the Letpot goes, the basil and tomato are doing better than the other systems, but for some reason the lettuce is just not doing well, and I have no explanation as to why this is so slow compared to the other. This is the no-name Aeroponics system, and it's been doing quite well too. The lettuce is doing really well. The basil is doing quite well. It's not quite as tall as the Letpot system, but it's still great shape. The tomato is also doing well. I notice the flowers are starting to develop here. The leaf coloration is a little lighter than I'd like to see, and the leaf size is not as big as the Letpot system. The root system's pretty good, but you'll notice that very few of the roots have actually reached the water. Most of these side roots just aren't really growing well. I'll stake this one up too. Here we're using the light from the no-name hydroponics system, but these three plants are growing in soil. The lettuce is doing quite well. It's not quite as big as the aeroponics system, but they're pretty close. The tomato plant is definitely the smallest out of all three systems, but it's doing quite well, and I think I'm just starting to see the flowers develop in here. I have noticed that there are some roots coming out of the bottom, and they did start growing into the water. So I'm taking these roots and making sure they're not getting into the reservoir. The basil is also doing quite well, but out of the three systems, this is the smallest basil plant. Now, one thing I did notice is that the pots were staying fairly moist because the pump is still running in this system. There seems to be no way to turn it off permanently. And then when the pump runs inside, it does spray some water out of these holes. And that has kept the soil a little moister. And at the same time, I think I have underwatered these a little bit, but they haven't dried out at all. So going forwards, I'm going to water a little more, and I'll make sure that the roots that do come out the bottom don't end up in the reservoir. The systems have now been running for quite a few weeks, and the liquid levels are starting to drop on these reservoirs. Rather than just top them up, I think what I'm going to do is replace all the liquid in the reservoir. The reason for that is each of these systems has a different size reservoir, and by topping them up, I'm going to end up with different nutrient levels in each one. By replacing all the liquid with fresh nutrient, I am ensuring that both systems have the same nutrient level as I'm using for the soil system. I want to keep these as constant as possible. I don't want the nutrient level to affect the result. See you in a couple of weeks with a new update. It's time for another update. The plant's been growing really well, and in fact, the plants are getting too tall for some of the lights. One of the reasons I decided to do an update. I was hoping to get tomatoes on here before I did this update, but there's just no more room to grow these plants under these lights. So I thought now's a perfect time. Besides, I want some lettuce for dinner, and I want to harvest it after I give you the update. The first system I want to look at is the Letpot system. It grew the largest tomato by far. I don't actually have any fruit on it yet, but it's flowered well, it's got lots of side branches, it's growing quite well. The problem with this system is that the light doesn't go up very high. It's really not suited for this size of tomato. Now this tomato is supposed to be a tiny Tim, and I've grown them before, and they're much shorter plants. In fact, I have some tiny Tims which I bought as plants in another hydroponic test I'm doing out on the deck. And those plants are nice and tight and small. So I don't know if these seeds are wrong and it's not tiny Tim, or the light level here is just not strong enough to keep the plants compact. I think I'm going to run a test and see which it is. But these are not growing like tiny Tim. Now, if you think back on the lettuce, it never grew well in this system. This is the original lettuce plant, and it's puny compared to the others. So I figured, well, maybe I did something wrong. Maybe the seeds just didn't germinate well. So I started some others here a couple weeks ago. I tried 3 different pods, 3 seeds in each one. None of them are doing well. For some reason, the lettuce seeds in this aeroponics system are not germinating well, and they're not growing well. It makes no sense to me. This system doesn't seem to like lettuce. Now the basil has done quite well, and it's one of the largest plants. I think the 2 Aerogardens are pretty similar. Now this one's growing a bit lanky here, but it's underneath this huge tomato plant, and it just doesn't get any light. So I can't blame the system for this. I think it's growing a little slower and a little weaker here because it's not getting enough light. And that really illustrates one of the problems here. There just isn't enough room in here to grow 2 large plants, or even 1 large plant and a smaller one. But you can see the root system's quite nice, and it's certainly doing well. Overall, I like this system. It's got a stronger light than the other systems, but it has 2 flaws. One is that the light stand isn't tall enough, and the second one is you can't take the light stand off to empty this, which is a bit of a pain. It's not a big negative, but a little bit of extra engineering there would have been nice. Now let's have a look at the root system. The roots look really good. They're nice and white. And you can see the tomato plant here. It's got a huge set of roots on it. It's no wonder it's grown so well. The lettuce is over here on the left side, and it's got a pretty puny root system, and that reflects the fact that the top is just not growing well. Now let's have a look at my no-name aeroponics system. The tomato plant has grown fairly well. It's the second largest plant in my test here, but the lettuce is humongous. I can't believe that this lettuce and the one I just showed you is the same seed, started at the same time, in exactly the same solution. This is huge. Now maybe it's grown better because it likes the lower light level. The basil's in here somewhere too. Now it's grown quite well. It doesn't have a very good root system though, but the plant itself is doing quite well. I've noticed the leaves on this are smaller than the Letpot. Maybe that reflects the fact that this plant is getting lower light level. And of course, again, we have the problem that it's trying to grow underneath these other large plants. See what the roots are doing. Well, they pretty much reflect what you see above. The tomato roots here are much smaller than on the Letpot, but the lettuce roots are quite large compared to the Letpot. It's no surprise that the root size reflects the size of the growth above. All plants do that. They don't grow a lot of green stuff without making roots, and they don't grow a lot of roots without making green stuff. Plants control the amount of both of those, and they keep them in a balance. More top growth, more roots. Less, less top growth. That happens in your garden too. The roots are nice and white. They look very healthy. Overall, this is a fairly good system. Its light is not as strong as other systems. It does have a nice high stem so you can grow larger plants. But again, I wouldn't use these for growing large tomato plants. These are best for smaller plants or leafy things like lettuce. But overall, I'm quite happy with the results here. My third system here is exactly the same as the second system I just showed you. But in this system, I've grown things in pots and used ProMix for my soil. But I wanted to use the same light system so I can compare the growth in the two. Now, if we look at basil first, the plant has grown really well. And in fact, out of the 3 systems, this basil plant has the largest leaves. It's actually grown quite well. The lettuce has grown fairly well too. It's almost as large as the Aerogarden system, but not quite as large. Now, you might notice that some of the leaves have died back here. And I think the reason for that is that these pots are really too small for these plants at this point, and they're not getting enough moisture and probably not enough nutrient. If I was growing this in soil, I would have gone to a larger pot, but I didn't want to disturb the root system in this experiment. I wanted to leave them the way I started them. That's a pretty good sized lettuce. You certainly can't say this is growing at 1/5 the speed of the Aerogarden, and it's much larger than the Letpot. Now the tomato plant is not growing quite so well. It's got flowers, the leaves are starting to die back, it's losing some of its lower stems. Again, I think the pot is just too small and it's not getting enough water. So out of the 3 tomato plants, this is certainly the smallest one. Now my experience for the last 40 years is growing in pots. And if I was growing these things in the house, I would put together a good light system, put these in pots and put them under that. But I wanted to see if hydroponics can grow them better. In my experiment here, the hydroponics is working a bit better. The plants are growing larger, but they're doing all right in pots. One of the advantages of pots is that I can use many more pots and put together a large grow system. I just need a larger light on top, like the one I use in my streptocarpus where I grow hundreds of plants. If I wanted to replace those with vegetables, it would be very easy and I could grow lots of plants. And as the plants get larger, I can move them apart. That way they always get enough light. That's a real problem in these Aerogarden systems. They're just too small. I think the best solution might be hydroponics with a larger light system. And that's the next experiment I'm planning. So what have I learned in this experiment? Well, I've come to a couple conclusions. One is that the size of the reservoir is important, depending on what you're growing. But as the plants get larger, and especially if you're growing larger plants like tomatoes, you want a larger reservoir. The problem with a small reservoir is not that they dry out, but that the nutrient concentration changes too fast in a small reservoir. I think a larger reservoir will keep that nutrient level a little more steady, and you won't run out of nutrients so quickly. You can solve this problem with a small reservoir quite easily. You just have to change the liquid more often. But a large reservoir would prevent you from needing to do that. The second thing I learned is that the height of these lights is really important. I have 3 systems here, 2 of which are identical, and they're a no-name product. And then I have this commercial Letpot, which is actually a nicer system. But because the light doesn't go as high as the no-name ones, this system is not suitable for tomatoes. There just is not enough room in here to grow a larger plant. So when you're buying a system, make sure you buy one that has a good height distance. And not all manufacturers tell you what that value is. The other thing that's become very obvious to me is that these systems are really not suited for tomato plants. I mean, I have one tomato plant here that's taking up the whole thing, and its leaves are coming way out away from the light. There's no light over here. These things aren't going to grow well. These types of aeroponic systems are really only good for growing smaller things like lettuce and some of the herbs. A lot of the advertisement to sell these systems says that these are so much faster than growing in soil. The one ad that I seen says these are 5 times as fast. Well, my little experiment shows that those numbers aren't anywhere near being correct. Now, I admit that the aeroponic systems did grow faster than my plants in soil, but nowhere near 5 times as fast. At most, maybe twice as fast. And I'm pretty convinced that if I grew these plants in soil pots in my normal grow area, so I wasn't restricted to these small spaces, growing in soil would be almost as fast as hydroponics. But that's a test for another day. When you're selecting one of these aeroponic systems, don't worry about the number of holes you have. Manufacturers are trying to sell you that as a big feature. But as you can see here, a unit like this with 3 or 4 holes, that's more than enough. Don't get sold on a large number of holes. In fact, I'd rather have a smaller number of holes and be equipped with something to cover them. That's a better buy. When I first looked at these systems, I thought these things were kind of useless. These are little sticks that you can put in the top, and they're used to tie your plants to and hold them up. Now that I've grown larger plants, I see these are quite useful. And in fact, the two no-name systems don't have these, and I really wish they did. Those no-name systems just have no way to tie up a plant except to the stem that's holding the light. So these are a good idea, even though they're a fairly simple device. Here's my overall view of aeroponics. I am going to do more experiments with these systems, but at this point, I feel that the systems are pretty cool. They would be great for growing smaller things. Certainly any of the greens like lettuce grow quite well in here. It'd be kind of nice to have these in the kitchen to give you this tomato smell all the time. That's also really nice. So they're a pretty nice idea. I'm not really convinced they're worth the money. I think if you're serious about growing food indoors, invest in a proper light system and either grow in soil or in hydroponics. But these Aerogardens, they're just too small to do anything with. I mean, you're going to wait a month to 2 months for one lettuce to grow. It's much easier just to go to the store and buy them. But if you set up a proper grow room and you have a proper light and enough distance, now you can grow all kinds of things, and it's much more productive. Now, I've put together all my hydroponic videos in one file, and you can get to all of those right here. And if you're interested in growing vegetables, here's my video of the 10 best vegetables to grow. Happy gardening.